Definitions of abnormality. So for the psychopathology unit, you need to be aware about 4 definitions of abnormality. Now they are statistical infrequency, deviation from social norms, failure to function adequately, and deviation from ideal mental health. So you need to be aware of how you would define those 4 definitions and how you could evaluate those definitions. So statistical infrequency is an abnormality definition that is based on numbers and it is mathematical. So it's based on normal distribution curve. So normal behaviour is behaviour that is very common within society. So that will be clustered around the mean. Any behaviour that is uncommon or statistically rare would be considered abnormal. So for example, only 2% of the population have an IQ below 70, and that is referred to as intellectual disability disorder. So a strength of this definition is that it is objective. So it's based on numbers and it's mathematical, so therefore there is no bias or subjective nature to it. So it is obvious and easy to class what is abnormal and what is normal. So a person that has an IQ of 70 or below, abnormal. They have intellectual disability disorder. A weakness is that abnormal or maladaptive behaviour can happen quite frequently within the population. So depression is an example of this, and mild mental health disorders. So it's argued that 25% of the population will experience a mental health issue at some point in their lives. Now, 25% of the population is quite common, so actually this definition would fail to explain why about a quarter of us will experience a mental health problem. Also, it's culturally biased and doesn't take into cultural differences. So it argues that the populations of the world are contained within the normal distribution, and it isn't. This varies across cultures and the mathematical nature doesn't allow for this. So what might be statistically rare in one culture might not be statistically rare in another culture. Therefore, you might be mistakenly diagnosing someone with abnormality when they don't actually have a disorder. Deviation from social norms. So that is behaviour that goes against the unwritten rules, values and attitudes within society. So the ways in which we are expected to behave. Now that is based on the historical context of the time period. So for example, in the past, homosexuality was considered a deviant act, and it is based on the cultural aspect. So for example, in Western society it might be quite common to marry for love, whereas in non-Western cultures arranged marriages might be seen as more common. So an example of this is antisocial personality disorder, so that is a person that goes against the norms within society. So a strength of this is that it is quite flexible. It recognises that the context will play an important part in what defines abnormality. So socially acceptable and normal to wear a swimsuit or a bikini on a beach in summertime. If you were to do so in wintertime, it might look a bit abnormal and people might think you're a bit odd for doing so. If you walk down your local high street in just a bikini or a swimsuit, that would look extremely abnormal. So it depends on the situation, the context of in which you are assessing that abnormal behaviour. As I said, it changes over time. So although the definition does allow for age and situation to play a role, changes over time means that we can't have a consistent viewpoint of what is classed as abnormal. Also, cultural differences will play an important part. So it's not always clear what is abnormal and what is normal in cultures, which might lead to misdiagnosis. So some ethnic minorities are more likely to be diagnosed with a mental health condition because the psychiatrists that are doing the diagnosing tend to be white, middle-class males, and they might be mistakenly defining the person as abnormal when they are expressing cultural norms for their ethnic background. The third definition that you need to know about is failure to function adequately. So that is when a person is unable to cope with everyday life. So behaviour that might be considered irrational or dangerous to themselves or to others. Now, an example of that would be schizophrenia, and it's important to be aware that it could be behaviour that is considered abnormal by other people because the person with that behaviour might not be aware that their behaviour is irrational or dangerous, and they might be posing a threat to themselves. Now, a strength of this is that it is observable. If a person stops doing the things that they used to be able to do, so that they were able to get out of bed and go to work in the morning, or they have stopped taking pride in their appearance and stopped having personal hygiene, it means that people can intervene and give the person the support that they need. However, abnormality doesn't always stop a person from functioning adequately. Actually, a person with a mental health problem might be actually quite good at hiding their condition. So a person with depression, anxiety or stress related conditions might be very skilled at putting on a mask in public and going about their normal functioning. So therefore we might not use this as a great definition of abnormality. The fourth definition that you need to be aware about is deviation from ideal mental health. So Jehoda created a criteria of health factors that she considered would make a person to have the ideal mental health. So they included having an accurate perception of the self, environmental mastery, being able to cope with stress. If you do not meet the criteria for ideal mental health, then you are considered abnormal. So a strength of this is that it allows us to target intervention and treatment into the specific area in which they aren't meeting the ideal mental health criteria. So, for example, if their behaviour is irrational, we might be able to help by having CBTs to turn their irrational thoughts into rational positive ones. However, it is ethnocentric, so it is based on the Western individualistic views of what is ideal mental health. So Jehoda's characteristics are based on what we generally in the Western society would consider ideal mental health. Now this is imposed ethic. We are imposing our values or norms and judging other cultures against that ideal mental health, and it might not be applicable to those of a different culture. So collectivist cultures generally are relying on others for help, which might be seen as abnormal in relation to this definition. So if we were to have a look at some past paper questions that might come up, you might get a simple 2-marker that is asking you to actually define or explain what is meant by one of the definitions. So explain what is meant by statistical infrequency as a definition of abnormality. 2 marks, so you would do the standard point explain, point evidence, point example technique. So 2 things. So statistical infrequency is behaviour that is uncommon or statistically rare within a society, my point. Then give an example, evidence or expand. So for example, only 2% of the population have an IQ below 70. This would be considered abnormal. You might get a simple match up the definition with the correct statement. So behaviour which is rare and not exhibited by many people is C, statistical infrequency. Behaviour which does not fit the rules of an expected behaviour is B, deviation from social norms. Behaviour which shows the inability to cope with everyday life is A, failure to function adequately. You might also get asked about a very specific question. So which 2 are the examples of Jehoda's characteristics of ideal mental health? Shade in 2 boxes. Now it's important to make sure you read the question carefully. I know it is in bold, but sometimes students miss this under exam conditions. Your mind does silly things when you're in an exam. So 2, you need to make sure you shade in 2 of these. So Jehoda's characteristics, you should have B, environmental mastery, and E, resistance to stress. You might get a question that is asking you to evaluate. Now, it's important to read the question because this is asking you for a limitation, so you have to make sure you give a weakness. So explain one limitation of the failure to function adequately as a definition of abnormality. So 2 marks, a brief description of how that fails to explain abnormality, so why it is a weakness. So point and explain. You might get a standard 16 marker, for example, discuss 2 or more definitions of abnormality. So remember, the command word discuss means outline and evaluate. So you're going to get 6 marks, so 6 key points, 2 to 3 AO1 paragraphs on your definitions. So I would probably do 2 definitions, or you could do 3. It'd be your depth and breadth trade-off. So it depends how much detail you'd go in. If you did more than 2 definitions, you'd go in less detail per definition. If you were doing 2, you would do more detail. So we could do AO1, so your description of 1 definition, then your AO3, your evaluation of that definition. Then I would go back to doing AO1 of another definition and do my AO3 of that definition. So it flows logically, and it's easier to write the evaluation directly after writing about that definition. You might also get a question that is asking you to apply that knowledge in an essay question. So Rob is a 6th form student who has started hearing voices in his head. The voices come often, are usually threatening, and make Rob feel frightened. The voices are making it difficult for Rob to complete his homework properly, and he is worried about how this may affect his chances to go into university. Rob has not told anyone about his experiences, but his parents and teachers have noticed that he appears distracted, anxious, and untidy. Outline and evaluate failure to function adequately and deviation from ideal mental health as a definition of abnormality. Refer to experiences in Rob's answers. So this question is assessing you on all 3 assessment objectives. For your AO1, your outline of failure to function adequately and deviation from ideal mental health, your application of those theories or definitions, so your AO2 to the scenario above, and then your evaluation of both of those definitions. So for this, I would do an AO1 paragraph on failure to function adequately. So abnormality is judged as an inability to cope with demands of everyday life. So this behaviour might be seen as irrational or dangerous and might cause personal distress to themselves or to others. I would then do a separate AO2 paragraph of relating that to Rob. So where is Rob showing abnormality in terms of failure to function adequately? Well, Rob is not coping with everyday tasks, okay? So he cannot complete his homework and he is untidy, causing others to be concerned and distressed about his personal well-being. He is also having personal distress. He is feeling anxious and frightened, for example. Then you would evaluate it. So a strength of this is that it is seen by others. So it is identified that individuals are not getting out of bed in the morning, or he's not completing his homework. Therefore, others can intervene and get him the problem that he might need. Not all behaviour is associated with failing to cope. So individuals might be very good at hiding their abnormality and the mental health disorders from the public. I would then move on to deviation from ideal mental health, so my AO1 on that definition. So it's an absence of failing to meet the criteria from Jehoda in terms of what is ideal mental health. So having an accurate perception of reality, being resistant to stress, positive image of yourself, self-actualization, autonomy, and so on. Environmental mastery, talk about those, maybe give a bit of an example to back up your point. You then say, in relation to the scenario above, Rob's perception of reality is not accurate. So hearing voices isn't accurate perception of reality, those voices are also preventing him from achieving self-actualization. So he is frightened that he might not get into university as a result of hearing these voices. So a strength of this, again, is that it allows focused, targeted intervention. So the fact that he is not coping and he doesn't have an accurate perception of the world around him, so he is hearing voices, means that we can do targeted intervention to help him get over the problem of hearing voices. However, again, it is culturally biased, which is a negative, and you talk about how it is based on a Western viewpoint of what is ideal mental health, and therefore it might not apply to all collectivist cultures and non-Western cultures as a definition of abnormality.